And so the American Civil War finally became what it was all about in the first place. A war between Southern planters desperate to maintain and expand slavery, and Northern abolitionists outraged at the very idea of slavery and driven to destroy it. On both sides, many, perhaps even the majority of soldiers and citizens did not view the war in these terms. Yet it was the bloody antagonism between pro- and anti-slavery forces that drove the nation to war. And now, the Emancipation Proclamation made the issue explicit. Southern reaction made clear its opinion of Lincoln's proclamation. On January 12, 1863, less than 2 weeks after the Emancipation Proclamation, the Confederate Congress made its response. All white officers leading black troops would be deemed as inciting servile insurrection and sentenced to death. Slaves captured in arms against the Confederacy would be turned over to the civil authorities of the state to be handled as slaves in rebellion. But though the Emancipation Proclamation made it possible to enlist large numbers of African American soldiers, this was not the beginning of the role of blacks in the Civil War.
Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
In the early days of the war, Union troops entering Southern territory found themselves confronted with the issue of what to do with slaves who had escaped Southern masters and then made it to the Union lines. The official policy for many months was to return all so-called fugitive slaves to their masters. Officials from the president down to most commanding officers ordered their troops to turn back any slaves that approached their lines. As always, Lincoln was concerned about the reaction among border states. There was always the fear that the slave states that remained with the Union would secede if the federal government moved too strongly against slavery. Even the Emancipation Proclamation itself protected slavery in the border states. Slave owners in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia could still count on the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 to protect their property rights. If a slave from a border state escaped to the Union Army, then he should be returned to the owner. But some refused to make that kind of distinction. General Benjamin Butler created a policy in which slaves reaching Union lines were considered contraband. These contrabands, if they had been previously working on behalf of the Confederacy, could now remain with the Union troops. For the most part, early in the war, the Union used contrabands in the same way that the Confederacy used slaves. Bill Sims, a former slave from Missouri, explains.
When the war started, my master sent me to work for the Confederate Army. I worked most of the time for 3 years off and on, hauling cannons, driving mules, hauling ammunition and provisions. The Union Army pressed in on us and the Rebel Army moved back. I was sent home. When the Union Army came close enough, I ran away from home and joined the Union Army. There I drove 6-mule team and worked at wagon work, driving ammunition and all kinds of provisions until the war ended. The masters aimed to keep their slaves in ignorance, and the ignorant slaves were all in favor of the Rebel Army. Only the more intelligent were in favor of the Union Army.
Even before Lincoln made his proclamation on January 1st, 1863, African American citizens wanted to take up arms in support of the Union. Lincoln had first called for volunteers to join the Army the day after the fall of Fort Sumter. Men, black and white, were eager to take up arms, and women also sought ways that they could serve. Across the northern states, organizations of free blacks prepared to join up. Groups in Ohio, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, and Pennsylvania all began organizing and training regiments of black soldiers. But the response was not what they had hoped. In Rhode Island, the drilling exercises were labeled disorderly gatherings, and police threatened to break them up, and similar treatment occurred throughout. At all levels of government, there was resistance to allowing free blacks to take up arms. The Secretary of War, in responding to a letter, wrote,
I have to say that this department has no intention to call into service of the government any colored soldiers.
In September 1861, Frederick Douglass asked in an editorial,
What on earth is the matter with the American government and people? Do they really covet the world's ridicule as well as their own social and political ruin? Our presidents, governors, generals, and secretaries are calling with almost frantic vehemence for man. Man, man, send us man, they scream, or the life of a great nation is ruthlessly sacrificed. Men are wanted in Missouri, wanted in West Virginia to hold and defend what has been already gained. They are wanted in Texas and all along the seacoast. And though the government has its own command of class, deeply interested in suppressing the insurrection, it sternly refuses and degrades and insults the whole class by refusing to allow any of their number to defend the national cause.
Did black soldiers actually fight on behalf of the Confederacy, as Douglass said? Certainly, the Confederate government used slaves in its armies. The Confederate Army had the authority to impress slaves into military service. In September 1861, the same month in which Douglass had written his editorial, the Confederate Army of the Peninsula called upon slave owners to send half of their slaves to Williamsburg, Virginia, along with spades, shovels, picks, grubbing tools, and axes. The owners were reimbursed 50 cents per day for the slaves' labors. Slaves were put to work on fortifications as teamsters, as cooks, and in other duties. There are some reports of free blacks and slaves actually bearing arms on behalf of the Confederacy, but the numbers are usually small and hotly debated. Louisiana had a large population of free blacks, some of whom were actually slaveholders themselves. Over 1,000 black soldiers and officers formed the Native Guard, a militia regiment in 1861, which served as part of the Confederate forces. The New Orleans Picayune described a parade of Confederate troops in February 1862. It wrote,
We must also pay a deserved compliment to the companies of free colored men, all very well drilled and comfortably uniformed. Most of these companies, quite unaided by the administration, have supplied themselves with arms without regard to cost or trouble.
The Journal of Negro History in 1917 reported that these men of color in New Orleans were the only organized body of Negro soldiery on the Confederate side during the Civil War. They were accepted as part of the state militia, forming 3 regiments and 2 batteries of artillery. However, there is some evidence that these free blacks did not join this militia by choice. There are some other reports of African Americans carrying arms for the Confederacy. Some slaves joined their young masters, the sons of their owners, as those sons went off to war. They primarily helped with the grunt work of soldiering, but in some cases they also carried arms. Soldiers from a New York regiment reported being attacked by Confederate cavalry and a large number of armed blacks in Newport News, Virginia, in December 1861. Armed African Americans were reportedly performing picket duty along the Confederate lines in Fredericksburg in 1862. But in general, the numbers were small and the reports stand out for being unusual. The Confederacy did not authorize black troops as part of the Confederate Army until March 1865, too late to have any impact on the outcome of the war. Far from wanting to arm their slaves, Southern planners were deeply concerned about squashing any possible slave revolts while so many white men were away at war. For over a century, plantation owners had worked to restrict the movement of slaves and, generally, free blacks, through slave patrols. These patrols were either formal or informal police groups, consisting of white men from all ranks of society. During the war, with so many white men away in the Army, the regular patrols were often supplemented with local militia or even light cavalry units from the Confederate Army. But slaves did not necessarily welcome the arrival of Northern troops. As the 1919 Journal of Negro History reported, to the majority of the Negroes, as to all the South, the invading armies of the Union seemed to be ruthlessly attacking independent states, invading the beloved homeland and trampling upon all that these men held dear. Former slave Jasper Battle of Georgia explained,
Them Yankees was polite like, and they never borrowed nothing on our place, but they just plumb ruined everything some of their plantations right close to ourn. They took near everything some of our neighbors had to eat, most all their good horses, and everything else they wanted.
But other slaves had a much different experience. Mary Anderson of North Carolina described the arrival of Yankees on her owner's plantation.
In about an hour, there was one of the blackest clouds coming up the avenue from the main road. It was the Yankee soldiers. They finally filled the mile-long avenue, reaching from Master's house to the main road and spread over the mile-square grove. The mounted men dismounted. The footmen stacked their shiny guns and began to build fires and cooked. They called the slaves saying, "You are free." Slaves were whooping and laughing and acting like they were crazy. Yankee soldiers were shaking hands with Negroes and calling them Sam, Dinah, Sarah, and asking them questions. The Yankees told them to come on and join them. They were free. Masters and misses sat on the porch, and they were so humble, no Yankee bothered anything in the great house. The slaves were awfully excited. The Yankees stayed there, cooked, eat, and drank, and played music until about night. Then a bugle began to blow, and you never saw such getting on horses and lining up in your life. In a few minutes, they began to march, leaving the grove, which was soon as silent as a graveyard. When they left the country, a lot of them slaves went with them, and soon there were no masters' slaves left.
Many slaves did run off and join the Union forces, either to build fortifications or to become soldiers themselves. Many in the North objected to Lincoln's proclamation. They believed the war was being fought to preserve the Union, not to free the slaves. Indeed, that had long been Lincoln's message. Lincoln had become convinced that emancipation of slaves held in the rebel states served the war effort by depriving the Confederacy of their labor. Every slave who raised crops to feed the armies, built fortifications to defend them, or performed countless other non-combat duties, freed a white man to carry arms against the Union. Even many of his generals disagreed, including Major General George McClellan, who had been Lincoln's general-in-chief earlier in the war. Some Union generals did not wait for the public or the president to decide the time was right for enlisting and arming former slaves and free blacks. In the spring of 1862, General David Hunter created a regiment of African American soldiers composed of former slaves. But many legislators were not ready for such actions. Representative Charles Wickliffe of Kentucky demanded that General Hunter explain his conduct in turning fugitive slaves into soldiers. General Hunter responded by letter.
I reply that no regiment of fugitive slaves has been or is being organized in this department. There is, however, a fine regiment of persons whose late masters are fugitive rebels, men who everywhere fly before the appearance of the national flag, leaving their servants behind them to shift as best they can for themselves. So far, indeed, are the loyal persons composing this regiment from seeking to avoid the presence of their late owners, that they are now, one and all, working with remarkable industry to place themselves in a position to go in full and effective pursuit of their fugacious and traitorous proprietors. It is the masters who have in every instance been the fugitives, running away from loyal slaves as well as loyal soldiers, and whom we have only partially been able to see, chiefly their heads over ramparts or rifle in hand dodging behind trees in the extreme distance. In the absence of any fugitive master law, the deserted slaves would be wholly without remedy, had not the crime of treason given them the right to pursue, capture, and bring back those persons whose protection they have been thus suddenly bereft. The experiment of arming the blacks, so far as I have made it, has been a complete and even marvelous success.
Hunter's success, and Butler's, would encourage the President and others to officially begin enlisting African American soldiers into the Union Army. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, recruitment of black soldiers began in earnest. Known as the United States Colored Troops, black regiments of all types, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, were recruited from across the United States. Nearly 200,000 African Americans served in the colored troops, which represented about 10% of the Union's total forces at the end of the war. One African American soldier is better known for her activities before the war. Harriet Tubman, famous conductor of the Underground Railroad, served the Union in the Civil War in many capacities: nurse, scout, spy, and raider. In June 1863, Harriet Tubman worked with Colonel James Montgomery under General Hunter to plan and execute a raid on Confederate stockpiles. Tubman initially scouted the area and then led Montgomery and his black troops on gunboats up the Combahee River in South Carolina. When they reached the plantations holding the stockpiles, they met little resistance. After confiscating rice, corn, cotton, and livestock, they set fire to what they could not carry. They then set about freeing slaves in the area. Over 700 slaves were gathered up from the surrounding plantations and evacuated to freedom. In July 1863, two incidents, one tragic and one heroic, highlighted the role of the U.S. colored troops. The tragedy was the draft riot in New York City. The draft was terrifically unpopular, and Democrat newspapers linked the draft directly to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Editorials warned that white men were being drafted to fight and die on behalf of blacks. Tensions rose, and on July 13th, they bubbled over. For 4 days, mobs raged through the city, attacking draft offices, federal buildings, and of course, black people. The property of black citizens was smashed or burned. Several blacks were lynched, and the Colored Orphans Asylum was burned to the ground. The mob violence only ended after federal troops opened fire on the rioters on July 15th and 16th. Meanwhile, one regiment of U.S. colored troops was preparing for an attack that would earn it a place in history. Made famous in the 1989 movie Glory, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment led an assault on Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina. The 54th lost almost half its men, including its white commanding officer, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, son of a prominent abolitionist. But they demonstrated a level of courage and fighting spirit that was the equal of any fighting unit in the Union Army and gained instant respect in the eyes of the nation. The reality of black soldiers dying on behalf of the Union while rioters attacked and murdered blacks in the streets caused many to reevaluate their position on African American enlistment. But in truth, African American troops had already proven themselves in combat. General Butler's Louisiana regiments, along with other troops under Major General Nathaniel P. Banks, attacked a Confederate fortification at Port Hudson, Mississippi. 10 days later, another 3 regiments of African American troops fought a major defensive action to protect General Grant's supply line during his siege of Vicksburg. This time, the black Union soldiers were not well-trained troops like the Louisiana Native Guard. Instead, these 1,250 men were ex-slaves of Louisiana and Mississippi and had been formed into regiments just 2 weeks earlier. They lacked training or sufficient weaponry when they were attacked by twice their number of Confederates at Milliken's Bend. One observer wrote of the black troops in the battle,
"They railed and charged the enemy more heroically and desperately than has been recorded during the war. It was a genuine bayonet charge, a hand-to-hand fight that has never occurred to any extent during this prolonged conflict. Upon both sides, men were killed with the butts of muskets. White and black men were lying side by side, pierced by bayonets, and in some instances transfixed to the earth. In one instance, 2 men, one white and the other black, were found dead side by side, each having the other's bayonet through his body."
39% of the black soldiers at Milliken's Bend were killed or wounded in that battle. But they managed to drive off the rebels and maintain Grant's line of supplies. Former slaves and free blacks also served with distinction in the Union Navy during the war. Former slaves and free blacks also served with distinction in the Union Navy during the war. Robert Blake was a slave in South Carolina until he was taken as contraband in 1862. He then volunteered to serve on Navy ships, eventually serving as steward on the gunboat USS Marblehead. On Christmas Day, 1863, the Marblehead was shelled by Confederate artillery on Johns Island, South Carolina. An explosion knocked Blake to the deck, and when he rose, he saw that the powder boy who had been manning a gun had been killed. Although he was not serving in a combat role, Blake took over the powder boy's job, carrying gunpowder boxes to the artillery loaders throughout the battle. For his actions under fire, Robert Blake was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. 24 other African American sailors and soldiers also earned the Medal of Honor in the Civil War. These actions by black men in the field and at sea changed the attitudes of many doubters in the North. In the South, however, the attitude remained the same. Arming black men, particularly fugitive slaves, was equivalent to fomenting a slave insurrection, which was one of the great fears of all Southerners. The Confederacy's policy did not change. Former slaves captured in the war would be returned to their masters, where they would face horrific punishment. No black soldiers suspected of being fugitive slaves would be exchanged for other prisoners. Lincoln's administration was outraged at the Confederacy's refusal to include black troops in its prisoner exchanges. In response, Lincoln halted all prisoner exchanges. The population of the POW camps on both sides grew far beyond the government's capacities to manage them safely and humanely. But Lincoln's administration refused to, as General Butler put it, barter away the honor and faith of the government of the United States which has so solemnly been pledged to the colored soldiers in its ranks. In fact, many black soldiers, even after surrendering to Confederate troops, would neither suffer in rebel prisoner camps nor be re-enslaved. Instead, they faced summary execution on the field of battle. The most notorious such incident was at Fort Pillow, where, on April 12, 1864, rebel forces under the command of Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest killed dozens of black soldiers and their white officer after their surrender. A Confederate soldier, Achilles Clark, wrote to his sister of the battle.
The slaughter was awful. Words cannot describe the scene. The poor, deluded Negroes will run up to our men, fall upon their knees, and with uplifted hands scream for mercy, but they were ordered to their feet and then shot down. I with several others tried to stop the butchery, and at one time had partially succeeded, but General Forrest ordered them shot down like dogs, and the carnage continued. Finally, our men became sick of blood, and the firing ceased.
As the war dragged on, however, more Southerners began to consider the possibility of offering slaves freedom for service in the Confederate Army. Although most were still outraged by the idea, the Confederate Congress finally approved a plan for enlisting slaves on March 13, 1865. The Confederacy managed to quickly assemble 2 companies of black soldiers, but they never saw combat. In fact, the first African-American combat veterans of the Civil War to enter the capital of the Confederacy were units of the Union's all-black 25th Corps after the fall of Richmond on April 3rd. 6 days later, on April 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. 5 days after that, John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln at Ford's Theater. The war was over, and slavery was dead. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, had been passed by the U.S. Senate on April 8, 1864, and it passed the House on January 31, 1865. On December 18th of that year, it would be adopted into the Constitution. But what was to be done with 4 million former slaves who had little to no education and no means of providing for themselves? Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, in January 1865, had issued Special Field Order No. 15, which provided land to former slaves. Heads of households would get 40 acres of land which had once been part of a plantation. Some would also get the use of a Union Army mule for plowing. About 40,000 slaves were settled on land under this order, but it did not last. Sherman's order had been made as a wartime measure, and for the policy to continue, the civil government would need to take similar action. Instead, in the fall of 1865, President Johnson rescinded Sherman's order. So how did these former slaves survive in the early years after the war? Their individual stories can help bring to light some of the issues that they and the nation faced. In the 1930s, as part of the Works Progress Administration, 2,300 former slaves were interviewed about their lives before and after slavery. Here, Fannie Berry and Dora Roberts share their personal stories.
I was free long time before I knew it. My mistress still hired me out, till one day in talking to the woman she hired me to, God bless her soul, she told me, "Fannie, you are free. And I don't have to pay your master for you now. You stay with me." She didn't give me no money, but let me stay there, work for victuals and clothes, 'cause I ain't got nowhere to go.
After After the war broke out, we was all carried up to the plantation in Early County to stay till after the war. The day the Emancipation was read, there was sadness and gladness. The old master, he called us all together, and with tears in his eyes, he said, "You is all free. And now you can go just where you please. I have no more jurisdiction over you. All who stay will be well cared for, but the most of us, we wanted to come back to be the place where we lived before, Liberty County." So he outfitted the wagons with horses and mules and gave us what there was of provisions on the plantation and sent us on our way to the old plantation in Liberty County. We get in such a bad fix, some of the people died. It seemed like the old Lord must have heard the prayers of his children, for a long way down the road, we see our old master coming, and he brung men and horses to get us safely to the old home. And when we got up there, I never see him no more, because he went back up in Early County.
Every freedman's story is unique, but they all tell of the hardships faced by a people moving from slavery to freedom. Some slaves fared better than others due to their own skills or luck, or due to a sense of responsibility in their former masters. But it was clear that the nation could not rely on all former masters to demonstrate such compassion. During the Reconstruction era, the federal government dissolved the governments of most of the former Confederate states and managed the states through the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a branch of the military. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to help former slaves obtain food, medicine, housing, education, and land to aid in the difficult transition from slavery to freedom. Initially, the Bureau's focus was on providing the basic necessities for survival: emergency food, housing, and medical aid. But its larger role was to help freed slaves get an education and find work, and to try to ensure fairness in labor contracts. Prior to the Civil War, none of the Southern states had any kind of universal public school system. The Freedmen's Bureau took on the task of establishing Southern schools for former slaves to teach basic literacy. By 1870, over 1,000 of these schools were operating across the South. They also established 24 colleges and institutes of higher learning for African American youth. Many of these historically black colleges and universities are still operating today. Another issue was that since these freedmen were no longer slaves, they would count as full citizens in the determination of representation in Congress, rather than 3/5 of a person. But would they be allowed to vote? Southern Democrats were angered by the federal control of their states. Many took their anger out on the freedmen. Some whites formed secret societies to resist and disrupt the new order. These vigilante groups, the most infamous being the Ku Klux Klan, included former Confederate soldiers, and they were essentially insurgent forces in opposition to the federal government. They used terrorist tactics of violence and intimidation to keep blacks and white Republicans from voting. The Ku Klux Klan would attack at night, wearing masks and robes to hide their identities. They intimidated workers for the Freedmen's Bureau and killed black political leaders and others. Former slaves Nellie Lloyd and Mac Taylor tell of their experiences with the KKK.
Us was never pestered by the Ku Klux, but I was given a warning once to watch my step and vote right. I watched my step and didn't vote at all that year.
Across the South, thousands of African Americans and white Republicans were killed by members of the Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations. Former General, now Senator Benjamin Butler, drafted legislation referred to as the Ku Klux Klan Act. Another former general, President Ulysses S. Grant, signed it into law. The act authorized the use of federal troops rather than state militias to enforce the laws in the South. It also empowered the federal courts to try Klan cases and authorized the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Grant took full advantage of these powers and dismantled the Klan. It would be several decades before the organization would rise again. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States with equal rights regardless of color. This act was passed over the veto of President Johnson, and the policy was further cemented into law by constitutional amendments. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, stated that all persons born in the U.S. are citizens of the country and of the state in which they live. It further required states to provide equal protection under the law to all their citizens and prohibited states from depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited any state or local government from denying citizens the right to vote based on race, color, or having been a slave. It is certainly true that governments stretched and broke these restrictions over the following decades. But the amendments gave African Americans and others the tools needed to eventually force state and local governments into compliance. During this period, hundreds of African Americans were elected to state legislatures. 21 were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, including 10 former slaves, and 2 were sent to the U.S. Senate, one of them a former slave. But these gains did not last. Once Southern states were redeemed and freed from federal oversight, they began finding ways to restrict the new rights of black citizens. The KKK and similar organizations had suppressed the black vote in the late 1860s and 1870s. In the 1890s, states created new constitutions that changed voter registration in ways that effectively stripped the right to vote from most blacks and many poor whites. Most prominent were literacy tests and poll taxes. African American leaders such as Booker T. Washington worked to have such practices challenged in court. But in the first years of the 20th century, the courts, as well as Congress, were not willing to fight Southern power on this issue. It would not be until the Civil Rights Movement, culminating in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that these barriers would be swept aside and the intended goal of the 15th Amendment would be realized. America's journey up from slavery took centuries. From the introduction of slavery at Jamestown to the 13th Amendment, almost 250 years passed. 500,000 Africans were shackled and transported across the Atlantic Ocean in the Middle Passage to face a lifetime of involuntary service in America. Untold millions were born, lived, and died as slaves. In the colonial years, slavery as a practice grew in the South, while the North grew wealthy in the slave trade. At that time, there were few voices crying out against slavery. Soon after the American Revolution, more voices joined the chorus, including prominent men such as Benjamin Franklin, and influential slaveholders such as Thomas Jefferson. Many believed that slavery would die a slow death. The Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery from an enormous territory and was a tremendous achievement. But the cotton gin gave slavery new life. As the wealth generated by slavery made Southern planters more and more powerful, they changed their attitude towards slavery from being a necessary evil that they hoped to be rid of in the future to a positive good, benefiting both the slave and the master. Slave insurrections and escapes, particularly in the early 19th century, led to harsher conditions for slaves. Meanwhile, Northern abolitionists looked at the horror of slavery, and their outrage grew until it boiled over. Eventually, the election to president of a man who was outspoken against slavery would be considered an offense so great that most Southern states determined to leave the Union. Though the North did not go to war to end slavery, the South did start the war to ensure slavery's survival. The fall of the Confederacy meant the growth of federal power over the states. If the Southern states wished to maintain the privileges of states, in hindsight, it appears that secession was the worst possible way to do so. During the construction period, the governments of Southern states were dissolved, and they were managed entirely by the federal government. Constitutional amendments and other legislation led to even more federal authority. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments ended slavery forever in America. Though African Americans would continue to struggle against racial discrimination, they had finally risen up from slavery.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Jordan's water is chilly and cold. God's gonna trouble the water. It chills the body, but not the soul. God's gonna trouble the water. If you get there before I do, God's gonna trouble the water. Tell all my friends I'm coming too. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water.
No more auction block for me. No more, no more. No more auction block for me. Many thousand gone. No more driver's lash for me. No more, no more. No more driver's lash for me. Many thousand gone.